For an economist to answer the question of how goods and services will be produced, or better yet, how the factors of production in an economy will be organized to produce goods and services, they will need to classify the economic system they're observing. Most economies can be classified along a spectrum, from one extreme of a purely market-based capitalist economy to the other of a purely command socialist economy. The difference between these economic systems is who decides how to use the factors of production within the economy, and more specifically, the role of government or communal bodies in those decisions. Economies that are generally more market-based and capitalist tend to have private ownership rights that allow entrepreneurs to determine how they will acquire and utilize capital and natural resources, and how much labor they want to employ. I would be remiss not to mention that slaves were once considered a form of capital under this economic system. Command socialist leaning economies tend to have government control or some method of communal involvement in decisions about the use of factors of production. Most developed economies land somewhere in the middle, mixed economies that have traits of capitalism woven in with arguably socialist policies. Still, some economies, like North Korea's and Cuba's, are heavily command socialist. On the other hand, economies like Singapore's and Hong Kong's, or perhaps in Hong Kong's case were, some of the most capitalist on earth. Even for Singapore, though, the government plays a significant role, especially in housing and the deterrence of corruption. The economic system that emerges in a jurisdiction can play a significant role in comparative advantages. We'll delve deeper into the comparative advantages and disadvantages of market-based capitalist and command socialist economies later. What's important now is understanding that economies can have production strengths that vary not only with the quality of labor and natural resources in the borders, but also with decisions about how factors of production are employed. The US may find itself with a comparative advantage in producing aircrafts, while Mexico is pretty proficient at making both automobiles and food, and Canada has its own advantage in producing timber. All three nations may find it particularly useful to enter into a trade deal rather than producing all of their strengths and weaknesses independently. That way, the factors of production in each country can be concentrated on the areas where they can produce the most output for the most input, effort, resources, and time spent. In a simple example, imagine two economies, South America and Europe, and two goods, computers and food. South America has its advantage in producing food, and Europe has its in producing computers. If both economies just focus on producing their own comparatively advantaged good, maxing output and giving each other access to the others through trade, then as a global economy, their residents will have more access than they would from their own economy's capabilities. This is the difference between a bowed out, and therefore efficient, production possibilities curve versus a concave one that inefficiently produces less than the potential the global economy could achieve. Think of it like this. If you and your friend took two classes together, let's say economics and history, and each of you had an advantage in studying only for one subject, you economics of course, and them history, it would likely make sense for you to each study for the subject you're good at and share your cheat sheet with the other for their weak spot. Both of you will spend your time most efficiently on what you're good at while reaping benefits from the other's expertise. While this is a poor example of academic excellence, it does illustrate really well why economists have generally embraced free international trade. Because technically, it makes sense for nations to focus on their strengths and trade with each other, ceteris paribus. International trade could also lend itself to what we call economic growth. For our purposes, we'll think of economic growth in terms of shifting the production possibilities curve outward. An economy that focuses on producing its comparative advantage may be able to devote resources more efficiently towards sources of economic growth. Growth usually comes from either increasing the quantity of laborers or productivity of each laborer, or increasing the quantity of capital or its quality through technology. In real terms, the less money the US spends on growing food it could import, the more that it could be used to improve the average level of educational attainment among Americans. And herein lies the real point of the production possibilities curve. As previously said, the two goods or services we're comparing on the graph's axis usually share a common factor of production, but they can also perhaps more usefully be a stand-in for the binary choice economies face between current and deferred or delayed consumption. You see, economic growth requires waiting and saving, deferring goods and services that would provide immediate utility to invest in those that will likely help the economy produce more in the future. Let's use the computers and food example again. South America may have an advantage in producing food, which provides pretty immediate utility for a hungry population. But that leaves few resources to use for computers, which may not immediately feed someone, but could be used to study agricultural practices and weather patterns, an investment that would lead to better crop yield and expand output in the future. The more current consumption South America could defer, or the more investment it could import in the form of computers, the better positioned South America would be for future economic growth. We could visualize this economic growth as South America's production possibilities curve expanding outward, especially as it becomes part of an expanded globalized economy and shares in the bounties of other nations. Theoretically, that all sounds great, but as you'll learn, the real world doesn't always reflect our theoretical models.